And turning our attention to today's session, first of all, it's great to have so many people. I think we've got 60 odd people on today's call so far. We're going to be looking at the world of pitching. We've done this all as we worked through the whole COVID pandemic. We've looked at this a number of times, but the reality is things are changing, and they're changing because the way in which we operate, the way in which we work is evolving. Very much now, hybrid is here to stay. If you think a little bit about the way you as agencies and consultancies, many of you have given up your properties. Some of you are now venturing back into offices. But this does create, huge issues about how does one communicate with your teams? How does one communicate with potential clients? You've got situations where you may be pitching for a piece of business where half the clients are in the room, half of them are operating from home, and so on and so forth. And it's very difficult, and particularly difficult to be able to do that with any authority or integrity or any originality, getting that differentiation. So I've asked Lee to join us today. For those that don't know Lee, it's the first time you've met him. You're in for, I think, an exciting ride and some great insights into how to be more powerful in your communications. He's the author of award-winning bestseller, The Busy Person's Guide to Great Presenting. He has a strong background in sales on our world, and leadership roles at Hertz Leasing and News Corp. He's also been a professional magician and mind reader. He's a member of the Magic Circle, and in a moment he's going to make me disappear and he'll take center stage. For the last decade, he's been trusted by many of the world's largest leading brands to deliver keynote presentations, workshops, helping people to sell better, present better, and network better. So it's my pleasure to welcome Lee to us today. And so thank you for joining us, Lee. You are now in the spotlight.
Hooray. Good morning, everybody. Thanks I'm very excited to see how many people have signed up and come along today. As Stephen said, if we haven't met, my name's Lee Warren, and it's true, I'm the author of an award-winning book. I was very thrilled to win an award. It's The Busy Person's Guide to Great Presenting. And I've got one copy here, which, by the way, as we go through our session today, I'll invite questions and comments at several moments through our time. And I'm going to send a copy of my book to whoever asks the best question today or makes the best comment. All right, a nice way of getting a little bit of engagement. The rest of you can buy it for $14.99 on Amazon. But one person, I'll send it to one person today. So we're going to go through, and I'm going to go at some considerable speed, I'm afraid. It's being recorded, so anything I go over very quickly, you can watch this at your leisure back. But there are some real ideas that are really useful for pitching and presenting in this strange world that we're moving into that no one really quite understands fully. But there are some ideas that are definitely working well and definitely going to work well. And there are also some mistakes that people have been making over the last year and are still continuing to make, which I really want to highlight, because some of them, even though they're obvious, they're really easy to miss in the speed of pitching and putting ideas together and presentations together and so on. As I mentioned, I'll stop several times through the session, just check if you've got any questions or comments. So throw them into the chat bar as I go. I'll keep my eye on them. Stephen will keep his eye on them as well, because I want to make this as relevant for you as possible. Obviously, you know your own challenges much better than I do. So anything I say that's you want more details on, just throw a question into the chat bar. All right, so just to set the stall out really quickly, there are a few things that are happening in the world of virtual presenting that are slightly different to SpeechMark's real world pitching and presenting. And they're what I'm going to focus on today, although most of the ideas are also useful in the real world as well. But we're facing, particularly in the virtual environment, we're facing a couple of problems which are either unique or exaggerated in the virtual environment. And the first one is the problem of attention. And I think you can make a very strong case that online, pretty much all of us, we have the attention span of a 3-year-old and the memory of a 90-year-old. We're really, there's something we're struggling with. We have this thing about trying to get attention, trying to keep attention and maintain attention. And particularly in a pitch environment where, of course, we may be not the only people pitching in a day or not the only people pitching in a week, where actually the camera, this way of pitching and presenting, speaking through a microphone, speaking through a camera, it tends to level people out very quickly. It's much harder perhaps to stand out, to make an impact. We really are very, very similar over a camera lens. So those are some of the things we're battling. I think it's really important to keep that right at the front of our minds, this word attention, when we're online. I'm very happy to take questions about that as we go. But there are three things that are important to focus on in order to get people's attention and keep people's attention. I rather like things in threes, and I like things that line up with the same letter. So these are 3 Ps. Now, the first one is planning, and you're all adults. I know you need to plan, but particularly planning in terms of what does it take in a pitch to get people's attention and to keep people's attention until the end. And what a lot of people are doing in a pitch environment or presenting environment online is they're taking what they used to do in the real world and trying to do all of that down a camera lens rather than planning for this specific environment, this attention poor environment where we're at the mercy of technology and so on. And one of the, I think, best things you can do in terms of planning is to be absolutely crystal clear about what the goal is for a specific pitch or a specific presentation, and focus entirely on that goal and cut everything else out like a laser. I've been working a lot with clients over the last year, I've without exaggeration, on hundreds of pitches since we went into lockdown. And again and again and again, the single best thing people have been doing is removing everything from the virtual environment which isn't essential to achieving a goal. Because the shorter you can make it, the pithier you can make it, the briefer you can make it, almost always the best for people at the other end of the lens and the microphone. There's a great technique for doing this, by the way. It's one of my favorite questions in pitching or presenting, and it's this, which is to really answer this question before you do anything else in your planning or preparation. And that is answer this question: what do I want the audience to do as a result of this pitch or a result of this presentation? The word do here is really important because in this environment where we're trying to get attention, trying to keep attention, you want people to be as active as possible, and you want the goal of your pitch or presentation to be driven towards action. Far too many people, in my opinion, are focused on information, all right? So they know what they want the audience to know as a result of their pitch, but they're not necessarily focused enough. What do we want the audience to do? I'm talking very specifically about by the end of the pitch, right? Not necessarily the entire pitch process, not necessarily the end of a 3-month chemistry, getting to know you, rolling out process. I'm talking about this specific pitch. So for example, it could be very simple. It could be what I want the audience to do is to ask questions and get engaged. That's a perfectly appropriate goal. It might be, I want them to be able to refer us internally so we get a second pitch meeting. Or I want them to be able to know enough about us that they're happy to continue to, I don't know, a chemistry meeting or a process meeting or a rollout meeting, whatever that might be. Focusing on what you want the audience to do is a very powerful thing in pitching. It really helps you to make your messages briefer, pithier, punchier very quickly. And it moves away from just being lazy and just giving people information. If you think about pitching really clearly and really carefully, it should be obvious that actually this format, speaking to people face to face over a camera through a microphone, it's a very bad way of giving people information, right? People misremember half of what you say. They make judgments based on how you look and sound. They misinterpret things. Right? It's a bonkers way of giving people information, but it's a brilliant way of affecting people with information. If you just want to give people information, make a website, send a brochure, send an email. That's great transfer of information. But it should be obvious that pitching, presenting is really about how we affect people with information, the emotional connection we can get, the trust and rapport and so on, and all those things that we know are really important in the real world. And we have to accelerate that process in the virtual environment. And focusing on this question, what do I want them to do, can really help us to do that, to get to what affects people with information rather than just giving people information. I'm going to carry on, but I'm aware that's quite a big topic and we could spend, an entire day, and I frequently do, by the way, spend an entire day on this question. But let me give you a very quick example from my own experience. 2 of my clients are 2 of the big 4 accountancy firms, the global consultancy firms. And I was referred by word of mouth to a third of them. So this is not in the virtual environment, but the lesson is the same. So I went along to the meeting. It was a partner level recommendation. And the recommendation was, if this person likes you, he won't work with you directly, but if he likes you and recommends you in the business, it's a shoo-in. So it's an important pitch and it's quite a quick pitch. So I went along to the meeting and I arrived 20 minutes early because of signing the name badge and all that sort of stuff. And what I didn't know when you meet a partner in that firm is there's no security, there's no signing. You get taken straight into the waiting room. So I heard the receptionist pick up the phone and say, Mr. Warren's here. And this person I was meeting barked down the phone. He's 20 minutes early. Right? He barked, I could hear it. He barked it. Not a great start to a pitch, but anyway, I got taken to the coffee waiting room. I sat there And I was waiting for about 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, the person running the coffee lounge came over and she said to me, remind me who you're waiting for. Bear in mind, I'm still 10 minutes early. So I told her. She went back to her phone, picked her phone up, phoned him and said, just so you know, Mr. Warren's been waiting for 10 minutes, because they think I'm a client, right? They don't know I'm pitching. I was furious. I wanted to lead across the room and club her to death with the phone, Anyway, so I sat there and thought, all right, practice what I preach. Let's understand the audience and let's think of what do I want this person to do. And as I was doing that, I got a message from him to say he was running late, sends his apologies, no problem. Anyway, I phrased it for myself, what I want the audience to do. I want him to know enough about me that he is able to refer me to people internally. So he turned up and we went into a meeting room and his body language was very defensive. And he said, okay, what have you got for me? Show me your pitch. And I said, well, I could, but to be honest, a great result for me would be that you're happy after this meeting to refer me to people internally, and I can take it from there. I can go to the next stage myself. And this man visibly relaxed. I could see it in front of me. And he said, is that it? And I said, yeah, that's it. And he said, oh, okay, well, I've seen your website and we know some people in common. Tell me a little bit about what you do for our competitors. And we chatted for 8 or 9 minutes. And at the end of that time, he said, okay, that's fine. I'll get my EA to send you some people you can contact. And then he said, would you like a coffee? I said this magic phrase, would you like a coffee? And think about what happened in that meeting. If I hadn't been clear on the goal, and I think this is why this applies so much to the virtual environment, I would have tried to take all of that time talking about myself, giving my pitch, probably rushed it a bit because we were running a bit late. Whereas by focusing on the goal, what do I want this person to do? It made the entire process much clearer, much briefer, much more human. I can't go back in time and repeat the experiment, but I'm fairly willing to bet the result wouldn't have been as good if I hadn't been as clear on the goal. So I hope that point's really clear to you. Again, drop any questions about that if not. The second P after planning, and one other thing to say about the planning is you have to know precisely where in your journey with this client or potential client this virtual meeting sits. Sorry, I skipped that part, a very important part. So in other words, why are you asking people for an hour of their time, 20 minutes of their time in this specific environment? That has to be, I think, a really big part of your planning. In other words, going back to this thing of affecting people with information, what is it you can do in this environment that you can't do with the pitch documents, that you can't do with the PowerPoint slides, right? What is it in this environment? That needs to be a really big part of your planning, I think. And I think the answer should be obvious. This is all about engagement, rapport, building trust and building likability and that kind of stuff. P is the second P is prepare. And by preparation, this is one of the biggest mistakes I've seen people making is this thing I mentioned about trying to do what we used to do in the real world down a camera lens. And the one thing you cannot do is what, if we're honest, most of us used to do, which is wing it a bit in real time. All right. So, a very typical preparation for a pitch is a couple of days in advance, put some beautiful slides together. If you're pitching with a team, say, oh, are you going to do the IT bit? Are you going to do the funding bit? I'll do the introduction and the closing. Great. We're ready to go. And then we'll sort of, we might have run through it once, maybe, if we've got the time. I'm exaggerating to make a point, but you all know what I'm talking about. In the online environment, there is no time for winging it. There's no latitude for winging it. We're much more exposed in this environment. If you're not 100% prepared, if you don't know where all the buttons are that you need to press to move to your next slide or to go in and out of screen share, if you don't know the precise order in which things are coming, the exact order of your slides, if you don't know exactly how you're going to hand over from one team member to another team member, you're really exposed in this environment. It becomes much more obvious. So preparation means a few things. First of all, it means being 100% on top of what is going to happen. The second thing is, and if you don't mind, I'm going to be Uncle Lee presenting expert now. You have to rehearse, right? You have to rehearse. And you have to rehearse, I think, at least 3 times. And rehearsal is not the same as practicing. And if there's only one thing you do after this, there's always a moment when a public speaker says, if you're only going to change one thing, change this. If you're only going to change one thing, rehearse, right? Rehearse at least 3 times. And what rehearsal means is you put a timer on, you start speaking. Ideally, in this environment, you record yourself and you keep going till the end of your allotted time, no matter what happens, no matter what fails on you, no matter what you forget to say, and you stop and then you watch the recording back and do that 3 times. It really, I think in this environment, it helps you to improve so much and so quickly. And think about it this way, because I know rehearsal feels awkward and stilted, and particularly if you're doing a team pitch where you've got to get other people involved in the rehearsal as well. I know everybody sort of pushes back against it and doesn't like it and ums and ahs around it, but you can't rehearse in your head. And rehearsal isn't saying, I'll do the first 5 slides, then you do the second 5 slides. That's not rehearsal. That's planning and preparing, right? But it's not rehearsing. Think about it this way. You've only got 2 choices when you're doing your pitch. You've only got 2 options available to you. You either rehearse in advance or you rehearse in front of your client or potential client, right? They're your only 2 options. And I hope it should be obvious that the rehearsing in advance is by far the better of those options. When I've worked with clients individually or in teams and so on, over and over again, what happens is people in advance say, "Oh, I don't want to rehearse. It feels silly. I'm better in the moment." Nobody is better in the moment. I've been really lucky in my life. I've worked with some of the world's best performers. Absolutely no performer will ever say, "Do you know what? I'm better without any preparation or rehearsal. I'm just better in the moment." No pianist says they're better in the moment. No comedian says they're better in the moment. No Olympic athlete says they're better without any preparation. They're better in the moment, right? None of us are. And I'm really aware some people disagree with that, but I don't think I've ever seen anybody who's better without a bit of preparation and rehearsal. The third of our P's is present, of course. Of course, you have to then do the presentation. You have to then run the pitch itself. And I'm going to go now into some of the details on how to do that with another series of letters that begin with E this time, words that begin with E. Let me just check in the chat bar quickly if any questions have come in. Stephen, have you got any questions or any comments for me before we carry on?
Nothing at the moment. No, well, you keep going, sir, and I'll let you know we got some crackers.
Good. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So 6 E's. This is a moment where you might want to have pens at the ready. There are 6 words that begin with E that really cover, I think, everything you need to know and do to set yourself up really well in the virtual environment. Obviously, the focus today is on pitching, but really this is about any encounter in the virtual environment. If you're doing team meetings, job interviews, anything where you want to come across as well as you possibly can in this environment, these E's are really easy to remember, and they're pretty easy to put into practice in many ways. So the first one is environment. And here I think we need to find the digital equivalents of what we used to do in the real world. So, when you used to go to a real world meeting, we all used to do things like, make sure our shoes look nice and check ourselves in the mirror to make sure we haven't got a button undone in the wrong place and that kind of stuff. And we need to find the digital equivalents of doing that online in many ways, of making sure that we're looking and sounding as good as we can. Obviously, there's quite a lot of latitude because we all know many of us are still working from homes. We haven't, got necessarily perfect studio environments. So there is a bit of a credibility given to us in advance. However, it's really easy to stand out by getting your environment right. If you're in a series of pitches, and again, it's on this emotional level, no one's going to analyze your environment bit by bit, but they'll feel it. It's exactly the same as walking in the room, having put on your best outfit that morning. So a couple of things you can really think about with your environment is obviously backdrops matter. Some people I can see today are using virtual backdrops and so on. Just be cognizant of what is behind you. Is it reinforcing your credibility? Is it reinforcing your brand? Is it neutral or is it detracting from it? So very deliberately today, I'm in front of what's often called the politician's bookcase. But that's because I sell content and information. That's what I do. That's my brand, if you like. So I want my backdrop to back that up. You'll notice if you're looking carefully, I've slightly blurred the background so that you can't get too distracted by the books. You could, if you're really staring, you could probably work out 1 or 2 of them, but it's just a gentle, nice background. You'll also notice, if you look carefully, a few things. So this white wall here is a little bit boring on its own. It looks all right in the shot. So what I've done is I just put a light on the floor shining onto the wall, and I've got a little pot plant here, which just comes into the shot a little bit. It just breaks it up. Now, if I was pitching, nobody's going to sit there and consciously look at those things, but it's just the image just pops slightly. I've shined a light on the bookcase as well, by the way. And it's just a slightly reassuring emotional tone when you go into a pitch or an important meeting. Okay, this is prepared. This is professional. This is ready to go. The other side of environment, of course, is how you sound. And if you're going to spend £50 after this session, if you haven't got one already, get yourself an external microphone. All right, one of the best ways to come across as authoritative and compelling and credible is for your sound quality to be as good as it possibly can. You can get terrific microphones for £50. I've got a hand up, by the way. If anyone wants it, you send me an email after this session or look me up on LinkedIn, and I've got a list of all the technology I use. Also, in terms of environment, of course, is how you're framed in the shot itself. And it's still unbelievable how many people are getting this wrong day to day. And ideally, you want to be like a Renaissance painting, roughly in the middle, and with your eyes about between half and 2/3 of the way up the shot. So you want to be think like a Renaissance portrait. You want to dominate the frame, not so much that people are scared by you, not like that, but equally, you know, if I'm like this, I'm not really pitching. I'm not that interested in you. And I know this sounds like really simple stuff, but it does have an emotional impact on people at the other end of your line, at the other end of the line. Environment also, of course, includes audio-visual aids. And some of you'll have noticed I haven't used any PowerPoint or anything like that so far today. I like graphics that appear on screen, and sometimes for a full pitch, I'd use pictures and all sorts of other things. But even with the way you use slides, you can think about slides in a slightly different way. So, for example, if I were, let's say I was talking, I don't know, and the point I want to make is there's light at the end of the tunnel. Well, I might do something like this. I might use a slide and use an image rather than just loads of text. Keep myself in the slide because I want to be connected to the audience. I want to still have rapport with the audience, but use a nice sort of full screen image. I've gone from something very light to something very dark. This is very nice. It breaks it up quite a bit for the audience. Another few ways of thinking like a slide, think of using slides, is think of keeping things moving. If you are going to use lots of slides, because this is a big part of the environment, but I'll talk about this in a second when we come on to experience as well. So in other words, don't just be boring with the slides, and certainly don't think of yourself as someone who talks over slides. There's a much better way of thinking, which we'll come to in a second. With this word, experience, this is the second of our E's, experience. So when you're in this environment, people are getting an experience of you. And this mistake I keep making of just repeating what we used to do in the real world, which is firing up our laptops, showing some PowerPoint slides and talking over those PowerPoint slides, it really is a very ineffective way in many ways of affecting people with your information. And in this environment, a great thing to do is think of yourself not like a PowerPoint narrator, but think of yourself like a TV host. All right, think of yourself like a newsreader host, and look at news programs for inspiration. How do they get your attention? How do they keep your attention? And they do a few simple things. They change a lot, right? They'll change shots. They'll change how things look. They'll change words on the screen. They'll change from presenter to presenter. If you're pitching alone, like I am today, doing a presentation alone, you can't do that, of course. But for example, if you're pitching as a team of 3, instead of, let's say you've got an hour, instead of doing 20 minutes with person 1, 20 minutes with person 2, 20 minutes with person 3, can you break it up more? So person 1 does 3 minutes, then person 2 does a couple of minutes, then it's person 3, then back to person 1, so that your audience is getting a lot of variety. It's more like a TV show. Even if you're using slides, you can do this. So for example, if I had to use, let's say, 50 slides in my presentation, my pitch, for various reasons, well, I can find ways of making that look a little bit more interesting so that I'm not just, that screen share shot that everyone's so bored with by now. And even with my slides, I might want to create a little bit of intrigue. So I might bring up a blank slide rather than just loads of text or that typical about us slide or whatever. And I might talk for a moment before I show you the slide so that there's a bit of that TV sort of drama. They're always saying things like, let's go over to Newcastle now, right? And they never go to Newcastle and then say, oh, this is Newcastle. There's a little sort of leading you on, if you like. So you can do this with slides, have a blank slide and give the audience a bit of intrigue about what's going to come next. And then visually, by the way, the point's very simple. It's just that if you use a bit of movement in your slides, it helps to keep things interesting. So there's a slide just with a little bit of movement on it, one big idea, that's it. And then if I want to progress the idea and say that not just moving things, but changing things keeps people interested, I might then just change something slightly on the slide, move my logo around, move the animation in a different way. And then, of course, still thinking like a TV host, I might mix up the format. So I might go just from straight text to mixing it up, adding a bit of variety and reminding you to think like a TV host. All right. So there are all sorts of ways that you can give people a better experience. And the better the experience is for the audience at the end, the more credible you are, the more believable you are, and certainly the more memorable you are. So really focus on the experience and try where you can, make it more like a TV show rather than just PowerPoint stuff. the third of our E's. But let me just check. I see a few comments coming in. Oh, okay, lots of questions. Let's stop for some questions in that case. Stephen, can you edit them for me? Tell me what the best one is.
Yeah, well, they're all good actually. There's some very good questions come through so far. So I'm actually going to start from the top, and then we'll sort of go down if you may. Question for Brett, and actually I was very interested. The use of graphics on the screen. What are you using? That's not a package that sits within Zoom, as far as I'm aware.
It's not at all. It's an external piece of software. What I'll do, I've got a list of all the technology. So to save time in this session, Stephen, if I send that to you, can you distribute that to everybody? Is that easy?
I'll put it out.
Great. Okay. So any question you've got about technology, lights, microphone, etc., that'll all be in the handout I'll send you.
Okay. This is a great question from Jay Hopkins. Jay asks, what's the best piece of advice you've got for creating a rapport with someone you meet for the very first time in a digital environment? And I'm assuming it's apart from sort of commenting on the weather.
It's a brilliant question. So there are a few counterintuitive things here. One is that it's really important, I think, to get out of the sort of habitual stuff we used to do in the real world, which is thinking that rapport building, A, takes quite a lot of time to do, and B, is often around small talk. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but some of the best people I've seen at building rapport online are people who are very, very good at getting to the point quickly. In other words, so there's a sort of reassurance here. Okay, you're not a time waster. You've thought about this. You've prepared this. And I know that sounds a bit counterintuitive, but that's a great way of doing it. So, for example, people have said things like, thanks so much for your time today. I know we've got 30 minutes together. I prepared a pitch for you. Actually, I only need 15 of those 30 minutes to deliver the pitch. So if you don't mind, I'll start with a couple of questions, then we'll get into it. And then there's plenty of time at the end for us to have a conversation and questions. Now, although that isn't in some ways traditional rapport building, I hope you can hear, although I made that up on the spur of the moment, there's quite a lot of rapport happening there, because what you're doing is you're saying, I respect you, I respect your time, I've put the work in advance of this meeting to make this good for you as the audience member. Now, obviously, they can take that over and they can respond to a few questions, and you might want to have a few interesting questions lined up. But the point is that tonally, what you're saying is, look, I know we've got exactly 30 minutes because it's online. I won't use all of your time. I've really thought about this and prepared this. So that's not an obvious answer, but I think it's a really useful answer. Other things that you can do are avoiding the classic salesperson thing of asking questions which you think sound good, but accidentally sound like you haven't done your homework. So the classic sort of, what's keeping you up at night, or what are the challenges you're facing at the moment, or what's going on in your market. And I'm not saying anybody on this call today would do those things, but I just mention that for completeness, because some people mistake those as rapport building questions, but that's quite old fashioned now. And it just sounds like you haven't done your homework. Great questions, though, are to say that you have done your homework and you'd like a little bit more detail. So I've prepared the meeting today based on knowing A and B and C about your market. Can I just check with you? Is that what you were expecting? Is that what we can go into in detail? Those kinds of things are great rapport building questions. Or what I've noticed about your industry at the moment is ... That's quite that kind of language is very great for building rapport as well. But certainly don't spend too much time on the small talk kind of stuff, and don't appear to be rambling or not knowing that you're going to get to the point. Jay, I hope that answers that question enough.
That's good. That's a great answer. And I guess the other thing is also the point you made on about preparation. So actually preparing those small talk questions so that you've actually thought about it and beforehand. One from Johnny Morris. Would you recommend following up your minimalist pitch presentation with a content-rich leave behind?
It's a great question. Thank you. And yes, absolutely, I would. And in fact, partly this comes back to that thing I mentioned at the beginning of you've got to know what you want your audience to do. So, for example, this is a classic case. Let's say that your goal was, I need them to read all the documentation. I need them to get it and understand it. And obviously, I don't have time to go into that. Well, if that's your goal, for instance, let's really exaggerate it. Let's say that's the goal. What that then implies is in your pitch itself, you have to deliberately leave things out and deliberately create interest and intrigue. So you have to say things like, I'm making this up on the spur of the moment, but you have to say things like, in our research, 37% of your target market said X and Y and Z. I haven't got time to go into that research today, but there's plenty of it there. It's on pages 10, 11, and 12 of the handout. I'll leave that with you at the end of our time today. There's some really interesting data there. right? So you deliberately don't go into that in the pitch itself. You deliberately leave that as some intrigue, and you're more likely to get people to read the document as well if you do things like that.
Okay, one more for now. We'll go back to you, and this is from Shitten Patel. Great to see you, Shitten, today. When I pitched as a team of 3, we had comments that there were too many changes of speaker. What did I do?
Okay, so there may be a couple of things that are causing that, and clearly we're dealing with human beings here. We're not dealing with science, so there's no such thing as an absolute unbreakable rule in anything I'm saying today. So you have to take it as guidance at best. One of the things that might be causing that is a lack of preparation and a lack of rehearsal. And so what can be very irritating in a team pitch is people handing over to each other, either in ways that they haven't prepared or ways that are boring. So what we'll see in a bad team pitch is something like, hi, everybody. So I'm going to do my introduction. I've done my introduction. I'm now going to hand over to Jenny. I think Jenny's going to talk about resources. Jenny? And Jenny says, oh, yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm going to talk about resources. Here I go, talking about resources. I finished talking about resources. I'm now going to hand over to James, James, you're going to do finance. Yeah, James is going to talk about finance. Hi, I'm James. I'm talking about finance. Right? It's an absolute killer. It's tedious. It's boring. And it's not what newsreaders do. What newsreaders do is they build a bit of intrigue and they pass over with a bit of intrigue. So if you're going to pass over to someone who's going to talk about, let's say, the finances, the funding, much more interesting to say, all right, everyone, so I hope that's given you an overview of how this might work. A question a lot of you might be thinking at this point is, how are we going to get this funding? How are we going to make this work? Well, James has got some really interesting answers to those kinds of questions. And then you hand over to James. And James says, thanks very much. Actually, instead of starting with the answer, let's start with the question, right? And he starts with an interesting opener. So that kind of thing will tend to make the handovers much smoother and much less objectionable. And also it makes the whole pitch so much more interesting, so much more dramatic, and smoother for the audience. But you have to plan and you have to rehearse to make that work. You absolutely have to rehearse. Okay. All right.
Having said, I was going to hand back to you there. This is such a good question. I really think we'll all enjoy this one. Is there a technique you recommend to get people to stop being distracted by other things, notifications on their screens, film, whatever's going on in the background? People seem to find it much easier to be less in the room for virtual meetings. And that's from John Ray.
Thanks. It's a great question. So the best technique is the most obvious one, which is to make everything you're doing as short and pithy and brief as you possibly can. The shorter the attention span you're asking from people in the first place, the more likely you're going to get their attention. So in other words, if you're saying to people, we're together for 20 minutes, psychologically, most people can stop looking at their emails for most of that time, quite a bit of their time. If you're with people for an hour, of course, it's very difficult to do that. So the first thing is make it as brief as you possibly can. Really boil it down. Again, this is why planning and preparation is so important. Other things you can do, I was going to come to this word a bit later, but we might as well do it now. So one of the other E's is engagement. So try all sorts of different forms of engagement. So those can be asking people questions, inviting comments and questions, changing the format. So this is why I think thinking like a TV host is so important, breaking things up a bit. So think, for example, if you were to say to somebody, we're going to watch a 7-hour film, most people would recoil in horror. But actually, if that's 8 50-minute Netflix series, that becomes a binge watch, right? It's not a 7-hour film anymore. It's the same thing, but it's not a 7-hour film. So where you can break things up, where you can change the pace, change the tone, change the imagery, all of those things create engagement. And you need more engagement the longer that your session is. I would try never to go certainly not more than 15 minutes without some form of engagement. And that might be really simple. That might be something like, okay, it's time to take some questions, type something into the chat bar. You might set up some polls in advance. It can be a very good thing to do if you're using Zoom and other software that uses polls, for example. If you're doing what I'm doing today, which is using some whiz-bang software, use that to its maximum, keep changing things, keep moving things around. And then the last thing, and this is the counterintuitive answer, is it's going to happen. You cannot stop it. You can't prevent it completely. So you need to prepare your messages knowing that it's going to happen. And that means, again, being as pithy as possible, repeating important points wherever possible, and giving them to people in various formats. So by speaking, by visuals, and in the stuff that you give them afterwards.
Thank you. Okay, well, back to you.
Great, thank you. All right, so I's. I just want to mention I's briefly. This is the third of our 3 E's. This is very brief, but just in case there are those of you on the call still doing this, one of the best ways of getting rapport, getting engagement, building that trust and likability factor is being someone who doesn't need audience feedback in these virtual pitches. So again, we're so used in the real world to reading people's body language, knowing how people are reacting in that room. Quite often you're not going to get that feedback, or if you are going to get that feedback, it's quite distracting for you to get it because you need to sort of keep doing this and look across at people's faces and so on. So one of the points of rehearsing is to become very good at looking directly into the camera lens, which is what I'm doing now. This feels very unnatural, by the way. And what feels natural is for me to look at myself, which is this feels completely normal to me, but I'm willing to bet for most of you on the call, this feels like I'm not engaged with you anymore, not as interested in you anymore. If I look back at the camera lens, directly into the camera lens, it's a much more engaging presence to have. And it requires a bit of practice. You're all adults. I'm sure you all know this already. But just make sure that you've got that down. And if any of your team haven't got that down, politely remind them that they need to be able to do this. Obviously, you don't need to stare into the lens the whole time. Of course not. You can look away, etc., etc. But when you're watching yourself back, when you're recording, do watch your eye contact with the lens and do check it out, because it's something that can really build trust quickly, and it can erode trust quickly as well if you're getting it wrong. You need your eyes to be seen, and so you need lighting. You need some kind of lighting. It really is astonishing how many people still are relying on natural daylight, and natural daylight is finicky. It changes all the time. Don't rely on it. You can't trust it. It's not trustworthy. Get a light, couple of lights, and make sure they're behind the camera lens, whatever lens you're using, and falling onto your face so that you can be seen. Again, this is emotional, but people like to see our eyes. They like to see our facial expressions. Let me just show you quickly. If I turn my lights off, you'll see the difference. I think straight away. You can still see me. You can definitely still hear me. It's just not, well, maybe some of you prefer not seeing me. I don't know, but it's just not as visually engaging. The camera's having to work hard. If I put my lights back on again, you can see me much more clearly. It's a much more pleasing aspect to have. So make sure that your eyes can be seen and that you're engaged looking into the lens. What a lot of people do, by the way, if you ever find that tricky, is a lot of people either get a post-it note and draw an arrow pointing to the lens or a little smiley face next to it. I know it sounds really silly, but a lot of people do it and they benefit from doing it. I've mentioned this one already briefly, but the penultimate of our, the fourth of our E's is engagement. So that's the rough rule of thumb. I think at least every 15 minutes, some form of engagement. Some of this you can set up in advance. So things like polling, for example, you can set up in advance. I've worked with clients on a couple of pitches, what's worked really well is sending some real world stuff to use during the pitch. So for example, some really interesting brochure stuff or something. I've got to be a bit sensitive. I don't want to give anyone away, but basically one of the things that worked really well was sending an envelope to the people who were going to be pitched to. And the envelope said, please don't open this until instructed during the pitch next Thursday. And there was a little surprise and a treat in there. And it was something a little bit interactive and engaging. And it really, really boosted the energy of the pitch. It was a great thing to do. And surprise, surprise, they won the pitch eventually. It wasn't just one meeting. It was a series of pitches. But it was a lovely thing to do. So anything you can do to encourage engagement. I've got one keynote I do where little Lee appears. Here's little Lee. Somebody made him for me. It's slightly terrifying, isn't it? Somebody knitted me as a doll. It's amazing, isn't it? Anyway, he appears. It's just for a particular keynote I do. The tone of it's lovely and charming, and he appears. Again, using slides. Think carefully about how using slides online. If you want to get engagement, want to get a bit more, interest from people, come in and out of screen shares. Use slides in different ways so that all the time your audience is, again, feeling like they're in a TV show. Right, it's a great word to focus on. Our penultimate one is energy. And of course, you need a bit of energy to present. This will sound a bit bonkers, but I promise you, if you do this, you'll be a better presenter. And it's like we're back at school, everybody. You could do this with me. A great way to have the right amount of energy to do a pitch to a camera, into a microphone, is to make sure that you're sitting near to the front of your chair, all right? So not leaning back in your chair. You can do this with me right now, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, right? Sitting right at the front of your chair. What this does is it automatically makes your torso a bit more upright, and that gives you a bit more presenting energy and a bit more vocal energy. And then if you really want to have energy, make sure your feet are flat on the floor, touching the floor, and that one foot is slightly in front of the other towards the camera lens. And what this does is as you're talking, it makes you just sort of naturally lean towards the lens a little bit. It gives you a bit of that presenting oomph that you need. You don't want to be sort of super dramatic and over the top about it, but you do need a certain amount of energy, particularly when you're doing the pitching part. Obviously, a bit later on, if it's sort of conversational and there's a long Q&A, you might want to relax a little bit into that. But for the pitching part, you want to have the right amount of energy. And that's a really easy way to get it. I'll do the last of our E's and then check for more questions. The very last one, lovely word this, isn't it? Empathy. And I think this comes back a little bit to the question earlier about people getting distracted, looking at phones and emails and so on. I think we do need to have empathy for the experience people are getting at the other end of the call. We need to appreciate it's really difficult to pay attention. Very few people are waking up in the morning at the moment thinking, oh, great, I've got 5 more Zoom calls today. Can't wait for them. It's rare, right? We're all getting, I don't think we're getting Zoom fatigue, by the way. I think we're getting attention fatigue or passive observer fatigue. But we want to be as empathetic to that as possible. Make it as interesting as you can, as brief as you can. And a great way of thinking in terms of building empathy is try and have one tweetable phrase for every 5 minutes of your pitch or presentation. One thing that's really easy to land in people's minds, really easy for people to understand. So, for example, near the beginning of today, I said to you, everybody online has the attention span of a 3-year-old and the memory of a 90-year-old. That's what I call a tweetable phrase. It's just another way of saying people are attention poor at the moment and they don't remember much. But that's not so memorable. That doesn't land in people's brains so well. So where you can come up with, if you've got 30 minutes, 5 or 6 tweetable phrases that you're going to seed your pitch or presentation with. It's a really empathetic thing to do. Make it easy to understand, make it easy to believe. The last thing to say about empathy is we know from psychology there are these things called mirror neurons that fire in our brain. And basically, if you see someone wincing in pain, there's a bit of your brain that winces in pain as well. If you see someone who's really enjoying themselves and enthusiastic and believes what they're talking about, there's a bit in our brain which gets enthusiastic and believes what they're talking about as well. And this is where we have one of the big advantages in virtual presenting is it's a more intimate format than the real world. If you're in a room presenting to 10 people, you are presenting to 10 people. Whereas in this format, very often each of those 10 people feels like you're talking one-on-one to them. So actually it's easier to build a bit of empathetic rapport with people if you're talking directly into the lens. And if you genuinely believe what you're saying and you're genuinely enthusiastic, you can build rapport more easily. And as long as you're not relying on having to see that feedback and sort of constantly glancing away to check their facial impressions and so on. All right, that's the last of our 6 E's. There's loads more I could carry on with if there are loads of questions, but if there are no questions, sorry, but let's check. Stephen, any more questions come in?
I've got a couple of questions for you, if I may. This has also come up, which is the issue with presenting to people on blank screens. And there seems to be a bit of a trend at the moment. We mentioned it, I think, at the start of the talk. The clients are tending to basically turn off their screens for whatever reason. And it makes it very difficult as a presenter to understand, is there any engagement? Are they actually interested in what I have to say? How can I learn from their responses? This is particularly rude, and therefore should we as agencies basically stamp down on this and say, look, if we're going to go to the trouble for pitching your business, then obviously we would appreciate the opportunity to be able to be in the room and see you. And then as an adjunct to that, this other issue which we spoke about, where you've got half the people who are physical, so they might be in your office and you might be presenting to them, but then members of your team or members of your clients you're pitching to could be on Zoom and elsewhere. How do you manage 2 medias at the same time?
They're great. They're both great questions and big questions. So the first thing in terms of people turning their cameras off is, I think, we can't fight it. And I don't think it's necessarily rude because we don't know what the circumstances are that other people are under. And lots of people are laboring under quite difficult personal circumstances. I mean, I have never been more glad to have a big flat with a garden and no children, right? Never in my life. I mean, friends of mine, who've got 84 children and no garden. I mean, what? How can you, the difficulty of pitching in that environment. So the thing to do first of all is accept that it's going to happen and that people are adults and they're going to make their own choices about turning the camera off. I have seen some people demand that cameras be turned on. And to be honest, it's really the digital equivalent of presenting into a room and saying to one of your client people, you've got to stand up and stand next to me during this whole pitch. I want you to be singled out. I mean, it's a really horrible emotional thing to do to people. But what this means is, as the person pitching or as the team pitching and presenting, you have to get over your need for feedback in this environment. You just have to get over it. And honestly, I know how much it hurts. I've spent most of my adult life, or all of my adult life, as a performer, and the last 10 years as a keynote speaker. I'm so used to being on stages and reading rooms and knowing how people are reacting and changing. And I've really had to get over the need for that feedback. I've really had to learn how to do without it completely. The best way of learning how to deal with it is to rehearse and record it and watch yourself back, because basically that's almost the same as doing it to a room where you're not getting feedback. But another way to deal with it is to get engagement where people don't need to have their cameras on. So again, this is things like taking questions, having polls, asking intriguing questions to the audience, get them thinking about some stuff. If it's a long sort of more workshop-y type pitch, which some people do, using things like breakout rooms, sending people into breakout rooms to talk among themselves, that kinds of thing as well. So any kind of feedback where people don't need to have their camera on. The second question, which is about dealing with this hybrid world, this is beyond doubt the most difficult thing to do. And even really experienced facilitators and presenters are having to learn how to do this in real time. The great news is nobody on the planet knows how to do this yet. All right, absolutely no. There is nobody in the world who is experienced at this, or certainly not more than has more than a year's experience in terms of presenting to the camera and having most of their audience sitting at home and some of their audience in a real room all at the same time. Even really experienced TV presenters haven't had to do this before. So there's a lot of latitude here. There's a lot of latitude for mistakes. People know that we're all sort of making it up as we go along. Having said that, I think the word energy is probably the most important. Rehearsal is important, of course, to give you the right amount of energy. But if you are, let's say there's two different ways this could go. So one is you're at home, you're in your own, your own studio space, and you're pitching to a camera, and half of your audience is also on camera, and half of your audience is in a real room somewhere. Well, everything I've said today still applies. You just have to be cognizant of the fact that the people who are in a room together will react very differently, and they will feel a lot more energy and a lot more engagement, because they'll be, if you like, reacting to each other in the real room, whereas the people watching on their own at home won't. So you have to deliberately make sure you're deliberately including the people who are only dialing in by camera. So in other words, that's directing questions to them, directing comments at them. So I'm making this up, but let's say Tom is in the room and Tammy is on camera. I know that Tom is going to ask questions because he'll be showing off in front of his colleagues, whereas Tammy might be quieter. So deliberately, as a presenter, I would make sure that I was saying things like, I need to move on now, but can I just check everyone's happy? Tammy, does that make sense to you? Have you got any questions? I would deliberately name the people, make sure they're feeling included, because it's very easy for them to feel excluded. And then you've got the opposite thing where you are in the room, you're physically in a room, let's say at a client space, and there's 3 of the client there and other people are dialing in. You want to be really, really clear where the camera is. You want to make sure that you're pitching to the camera as much as to the people in the room. And I would start your pitch by telling people you are deliberately going to do this, right? Don't fudge it and don't try and pretend that you're not going to do it. So I would start by saying something like, it's really good to be here, everybody. I'm aware, we've got John and Jane and Jill in the room with me today. We've also got person A, person B, person C dialing in on camera. I'm going to try and include you all. So that means sometimes I'll be talking straight into the camera. Sometimes I'll be talking to the room. I don't want anyone to feel left out. Right? I would deliberately mention that as part of your energy, as your opener. All right. Hope that answers the question enough, Stephen.
It does. Thank you very much indeed. And the other thing to mention, I think quite a few of you are aware of this, is that we tend to capture content on all of our calls. So there's an illustration of the output from the day, which is actually a really useful technique too for when you're pitching. So for those that don't know Ralph Mann from Purple Heron, if you want to find a way to actually communicate what we've been talking about today, or in any pitch to a potential client, it's a useful takeaway for a client. It really does summarize, along with video, what the outputs have been from that particular session. And it's quite a unique and different way of doing things. Okay, well, for me, we could go on talking for ages, couldn't we? I mean, there is so much to learn, so much to think about. But for me, the central thought that actually you have to think of yourself as a television presenter, and you have to engage and create content that actually is engaging and amusing when necessary, to try and get your points across. And equally too, what we have achieved on this session is we've actually covered it, and we've covered it within the time span allocated. And actually, we're going to give you a present, which is to give you back a little bit more time, which I think everybody will appreciate before they go on to the next call. So I would like to thank Lee, some fantastic insights as always, and some great techniques that we can all help to develop and become better presenters, better pitchers, and things that I guess that we need to share with our teams and discuss. Lee is available, as always, to come and help you and your teams if you need any coaching, training or development. Equally too, in the real world, if you're going to be managing or running events and you need an ACE facilitator and somebody who can really help bring your event alive, I can't recommend him enough. Next week, we will be turning our attention to the world of content and how that's changing. We'll have a panel of authors, re-authors, videographers and podcast specialists to give you advice, tips and ideas on how to improve your clients and your own content. Because like everything else, content's evolving rapidly, and the channels that we're employing and the medias that we're using. So please join us next week. There will be a separate invitation sent out after today. But once again, I think if we can all sort of show our appreciation and thank Lee for his time today, which he's given up so generously, I really do appreciate it. And excellent presentation, as always. Lee, I will share all the lovely notes that are coming in. We can probably see it on the chat there with you, and all your time. And let's speak soon. I'll share the video later on, everybody. And if you've got any further comments, I'll also share with you Lee's contact details so you can connect with him. And we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thank you very much.